Hey everybody, welcome to episode 8 of the Sugar Chronicles. Been a while since we've posted one of these, and today we have a very special guest, Dr. Mike Breen. Dr. Breen, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. This will be fun.
Yeah, so if you would like to tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do and...
Right on.
Yeah.
Well, I'm a chiropractor. I just started my 32nd year of practice, which is remarkable. I don't know where the time went. But what's notable about that is that I got into chiropractic more from the kind of the performance athletic side of things. I was a competitive athlete, and so my background was in the study of human performance and exercise physiology, and all of that stuff got me into the field of chiropractic. How I got interested in that was from that angle. But I got down to chiropractic college, and of course, nutrition is a significant part of chiropractic education, which many people who are listening and people in the public would never know.
Didn't know.
That's not the case that people understand that. And quite honestly, it was fairly new to me, and yet the first 2 years there was multiple courses that were in nutrition, and in the first year, the professor of nutrition that I had there was one of the smartest people that I've ever met in my life. It was just remarkable, and he was talking about nutritional impact on health at a level that I just had no idea existed. And quite honestly, the class was difficult, and it was, at that point for me, it was so far above my head, but I loved going to the class because it was so fascinating just to see this connection. And that began the whole process of my integration of nutritional knowledge into my business and into my practice of chiropractic. So that started back in 1983, actually. And so it's been about 35 years of just accumulating data and applying it. Many things have changed and shifted and moved, as is true in all forms of science. You come up with new things, but in the nutritional field it has changed a ton, but particularly in the last, depending on who you talk to, but the last 20 years, 10 years, 15 years, the biochemical understanding of the influence of nutrition has just exploded, and there's more data now to support the use of nutritional strategies to treat illness than there has ever been in the past. It's really quite remarkable, and I love this stuff, and I study it and read it just about every single day. That there's something that comes around that I'm interested in. So it's been a process, a 3-decade process of accumulating information, and it's exciting. I'm excited now, 32 years into my business, as I was at the beginning as a rookie. So it's a neat time to be in healthcare, that's for sure.
Well, you the interaction that I've had with you, you are a wealth of knowledge for sure.
Right.
And you've impressed upon me the importance of nutrition,
Right.
for sure.
Right, yeah.
And then the other part of that is hearing you talk again right now. It gets me excited. I'm like, am I too old to delve into the nutrition side of
Never. No. It takes time to accumulate background.
Yeah.
And there's value in that. However, this area that is known as functional medicine is a very rapidly rising source of health application, and to start to study it right now for anyone, even on an amateur basis, is just fascinating. It would be hard to become someone who could be a practitioner of it without a lot of background, but could you become understanding of the data to the point where you could clearly help yourself? The answer is without question that would be the case, and even be able to give tips and advice to friends, and maybe even direct them to becoming more healthful from a level of knowledge. So I encourage people to do that. I think it's a great thing to do.
That's awesome.
It's self-empowerment. In the end, we have to be healthful for ourselves, and I think the nature of the way healthcare systems have developed has been that consumers got the sense that they could externalize responsibility. That I don't have to do anything. I can put the responsibility on a doctor of whatever type to diagnose me, and then they will prescribe me something, and all my job is to, in the pharmaceutical sense at least, is to swallow a pill, and that's all I have to do. And that's part of the problem, quite honestly, is that externalization of responsibility has led us to the point where we don't think that we have any control over our own health outcomes, but moreover, we don't think we need to even pursue it, and that's a big issue. So once we switch that over and give people the sense that no, You are the person who will determine your health outcome. Some people don't like to hear that, but we like to let them know that this is the most empowering thing that you can ever hear, is that you get to choose, to a large extent, what's going to happen to you over the rest of your life from a health perspective.
Right. And that is very true. And it is, you know what, it is hard to hear. It's
Right.
hard. It's kind of because, well, can't you fix me? Can't you fix me?
Right, yeah.
So,
yeah, that's what we've grown up in.
Yeah.
And
Totally.
that's part of the, I say problem, I don't mean to be too negative when I say that, but it's part of the phenomena that exists.
Exactly.
And to change people's behaviors that way is tricky.
Yeah, it's how our brains have been trained,
Right.
for sure.
Yeah.
So we are here today to talk mostly about sugar.
Neat.
And because you know that's a subject that's near and dear to me.
It sure is.
I've battled my addiction to sugar for years.
Yeah.
I got pretty good
You
at
did.
controlling, and I
Yes.
have fallen off
And
the
all
wagon.
the listeners should know that.
Yes.
For
except-
someone who's out there who really feels that they are, Darcy did very, very well. And it wasn't easy, but you did well.
It wasn't easy. I
Mhm.
did well. However,
Mhm.
I have fallen off.
Have you? Okay.
I have, unfortunately, and people who have watched me go through my cycles
Yeah.
have said, this one's your worst. This
Oh,
one
no
is definitely
kidding.
your worst. So
Okay.
I'm at a point, this worked out well, that our meeting today,
Right.
because this past week I thought, okay, no, this has to stop.
Right
And I
on.
know what I'm in for, the
Right.
withdrawals, all of that fun
Yes.
stuff.
Yeah.
So, I attended a year-long program with yourself
Mhm.
and Christopher Lawrence.
Right,
And
yeah.
Christopher had been on our podcast previously, and we had conversations about this.
Yeah.
So, we spent a lot of time talking about healthy eating
Mhm.
and not necessarily about sugar. So today I'd kind of like to focus on the sugar thing.
Okay,
just
sure.
because.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about, in your profession,
Mhm.
if you're treating someone,
Yeah.
would you, like, if you were treating me, would you relate it back to maybe I have sugar problems that cause other problems?
Well, that is an absolute. We know that that's the case, and that's part of that biochemistry that I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago
Okay.
about the just the rapid rise and the change in the whole understanding of how the body functions and the influence that our diet, which includes sugar to a large extent, has on all functions of the body. It's a hard message for some people to hear, quite honestly, but it's the very, very best science that exists at this time relates to that. And high sugar volumes in our blood, therefore high insulin volumes in our blood, are most definitely associated with what are called inflammatory tendencies. It actually drives inflammatory phenomena. And again, this is not the inflammation that you get when you sprain your ankle. We're talking about cellular inflammation within the 10 trillion cells of the body. Those cells could be in your brain, they could be in your heart, they could be in your liver, they could be in your spleen, in your pancreas, they could be in your bone, they can be everywhere. What's really, it's interesting to me, is that 10 people could eat the exact same diet, identical with the same sugar volumes, etc. And each one of those 10 people could get completely different outcomes in terms of inflammatory tendencies. So really it's what inflammation does to initiate changes in our genetic makeup. That's where the really, really cool stuff is. Now, you know me, Darcy, once I get started, I might not shut up. This could be an hour long right now. So if you want me to answer another question, you just tell me to stop. But this is where it gets really quite cool. So back in 1999, but leading up to 1999, there was a very interesting time in science. There was this project called the Human Genome Project. There was two main companies who were doing the best that they can to try to identify the genetic code to unlock the whole long line of nucleotides that exist within our DNA, the deoxyribonucleic acid, which is basically our genetic code. That's what the genes are, is this DNA. And it was this race to do it. interesting, from 1999 to 2017, the computer capacity has gotten so much better in that very short period of time that you can send your DNA off to a company, that me in 23 thing, and they zip it in a computer and send it back to you right away. But back then, it took years and months to develop the computer program to do this. So the point is this, is that we're trying to identify the genetic code. Why? The answer is because we lived at a time back then where the science was what we call genetic determinism, which meant that once you're born with the genes that you were born with, that was your outcome. You were going to have an outcome. There was nothing you could do. The genes defined what would happen to you. The thought was that if we could actually figure out what the genetic code is, and then with advancing science, be able to manipulate the genes and therefore prevent disease. That was the thought. So the process goes like this. Genes actually code for proteins. That's what they do in our body. They actually make proteins, and proteins make our body work. So there's about 100,000 proteins in the body, maybe 125 depending on categories and things like that. So those are all the proteins. So they're saying, okay, well, we're looking for a genetic code that has about 100,000 genes in it, somewhere in that range. So they get all their data, and they get the computer spinning and whirring. I'm making it up, but you can imagine that that's what it is. And then all of a sudden the answer spits out, and they find 25,000 genes. And in the science editorial papers, they called it the cosmic joke. They thought that the scientists had so much certainty that they were going to find this number of genes, they just wanted to find the sequencing. And all of a sudden the universe went, gotcha, like a great big change. So the genetic code of human beings is way smaller than what was thought before. But what's interesting about it is that the genetic code of a human being is not remarkably more complex than that of a fruit fly. In fact, there's some plants that have genetic codes that are actually longer than the genetic code of a human being, which is remarkable. So what that did, again, we're taking a whole bunch of time and squishing it into a very short period, is it began the initiation of a new field, which had thoughts from before, from prior to the turn of the century, but this really accelerated it, called epigenetics. Not just genetics, but epigenetics. And epi means above, or more important than. And so where it all shifted after that was that the interpretation that genes do not self-express, that you are not a victim of your genetic outcome, that in fact the environment tells the genes what to do. So I'll say it again, genes do not self-express. They require a trigger. So when we consume things, or when we're exposed to things, including toxins in the environment, these things have an influence on initiating genetic output. We all have genes for good things, and we all have genes for bad things as well. So it depends on how our lifestyle and the environment also means food that we eat, how that actually influences our genetic expression. And if we're exposed to a bunch of good things, then we get very positive genetic expression, healthful genetic expression. But if we're exposed to bad things, environmental toxins, sugar, then we get bad genetic expression, disease, chronic disease. And this is the field of functional medicine, is that how do we optimize our environment, which is everything that we do, but food is huge, it's a big thing, to make sure that we optimize or lead to the most positive level of expression of genetic influence in our body, and to reduce or minimize the negative genetic expression. That's how we control disease, by controlling our environment. So the question was about sugar, but one of the most significant influences, and there's a lot of them, but one of the most significant influences is this inflammatory effect that is kicked in by sugar. Not just O. Henry bars, right? But everything. And in our diet, one of the things that's so surprising and sometimes frustrating and difficult for people is to look at where sugar exists in the diet. So the macronutrients in our diet are carbohydrate, protein, and fat. Those are the three macronutrients. So protein, I think most people have a sense of what protein is. Protein, you don't really have to think about it too much. It comes from meat and from other sources like that. Fat is fat. We got a pretty good sense of fat. There's butter and there's oils and all those kinds of things. And then we have carbohydrate. But that's kind of like a scientific term, isn't it? What is carbohydrate?
Well, for me, I think of breads, grains. I didn't realize until I came through healthy transformations that it included things like fruit and vegetables and all that kind of stuff. I had No idea.
Yeah.
I didn't think of it that way.
So what is carbohydrate? Carbohydrate is sugar.
Yeah.
That's what carbohydrate is. And so there are very, very weak carbohydrates, and there are very, very dense carbohydrates. So the weak carbohydrates are things like lettuce, for example, or spinach, or those kinds of things. So they are a carbohydrate, but the sugar concentration in those foods is remarkably low. Very, very highly nutritious stuff, very low sugar volume, but still a carbohydrate. Then we go to the other end of the scale, and we have foods, not just, again, not O. Henry bars and bottles of Coke. We're talking about food that is actually higher up on the glycemic index scale, which means that it's a more dense sugar. And these are things like you just mentioned, like potatoes and rice and pasta and grains and those kinds of things. And our diet, to a very large extent, and that is another topic in and of itself, but it has shifted so dramatically to eating foods that are very high in carbohydrate density. And so a lot of the sugar consumption that we get comes from these foods. So a person says, well, I don't eat a lot of sweets. And so I ask them what their diet is. I go, I know you're not eating a lot of sweets, but you still are eating a lot of sugar. And they don't even realize that they're doing that. And so that's the case. So understanding, explanation, all that kind of stuff becomes critically important for people to really understand that. And working towards a diet that reduces sugar volume, particularly from the foods that we don't think are high in sugars, is a really key thing. Now, if a person's eating a lot of refined sugar products, that's pretty obvious. And boy, I'm making it sound like it's easy, and it's not that easy. There's a lot of behavioral management that's involved in this kind of stuff. But in the end, it's hard to really grasp onto the behavioral need to do these things if you don't know how bad it is. You have to have a bit of information to say, holy mackerel, I had no idea that this is what caused that. And now that I know, can you help me? And the answer is yes. That's where you start to work through the behavioral things. But that's a big piece, is the sugar, which drives inflammatory tendencies, and the inflammatory tendencies therefore affect cellular function, which affects genetic output. That's basically the trail.
I think that's what I need to go back and focus on.
There we go.
Start Googling some things in that. So I have to tell you a quick little story from the other day. I was out to some of my properties for work, and I stopped at lunch at Sobeys. I thought, okay, I'm going to get myself a salad, prepackaged salad. Great. And then as I'm walking to the checkout, I get to the Halloween candy display. Of course, I can't just walk by. So they had Mars bars.
Right.
Box of Mars bars, 25 Mars bars for $5.99. To me, that's outrageous. Like, I'm not paying that for those little Halloween size. But then right beside it, they had 50 for $7.49 on sale. And I'm thinking, hey, wait a second. Double the amount. So what did I do? I bought my box of Mars bars. And I'm thinking, I think it's like the outside world, media, all that kind of stuff. That's how they get you. And like, you have to retrain your brain to think of the after effects of that.
Totally, yeah. I mean, you are not like, are so much like everybody else, where you look for value, and it doesn't matter whether it's Mars bars or socks, right? You know, you think you're getting a deal, and then it's good to get a deal, right? We all want to do those kinds of things, and in those kinds of circumstances, the question would become, even though I'm getting a deal, I'm getting twice as many Mars bars for only $2.50 more, or whatever it was. Does that make it a good decision, right? And that's where, you know, the mindfulness that we work with, and that you mentioned Christopher Lords before, is remarkably helpful to people in having them come to become mindful, to stop and question, instead of acting reflexively, or instead of acting on an economic basis on what to eat. Stopping and thinking about really what should you do. And again, my piece, as I suggested just a minute ago, is to give people the knowledge, the understanding of what does this stuff actually do. If I know that this is producing this outcome, or that it has the potential to produce this outcome, to initiate negative genetic expression. And again, in my brain, it's easy because I understand this stuff. And so whenever I'm looking at food, it's just my mind automatically goes to that. So it's a pretty easy thing. But for other people, that's what we have to do, is get them to the point where they understand this. Then when that reflex kicks in, you know what I'm talking about. There's a pause, there's a stop, and you go, okay, before I reach out and grab it, let me just stop and think for a second. And you don't have to think for 10 minutes, you think for 15 seconds sometimes, and all of that information. It's amazing how fast our brains work under the circumstances. And if you have something in your mind that counters the reflex to act on the value proposition, which is what you acted on in that circumstance, then it gives you the strength, I guess, to be able to make a better decision. And really, that's a huge piece of this, because we have fallen into this circumstance. Culture has, I shouldn't say fallen into it, culture has created this circumstance, rightly or wrongly, we pass no judgment on that, where food is so plentiful, it's so available, that we don't have to stop and think. We don't have to plan anymore. You can leave the house at 6 in the morning, come home at 7 o'clock at night. You had no idea or no plan what you're going to do in terms of your eating when you leave the house, and you come home at 7 o'clock at night stuffed, with never having to plan or think about it, because it's always around. It's always around us. And a lot of those decisions, you think about from a menu what you want, but it's not driven by health. It's driven by a whole bunch of other factors. And that's where we've come to. And unfortunately, we need to get back to a point where we understand truly what food is. It's not just a convenience thing. It's not just a gas tank. It's like restaurants are not filling stations, right? There's way more to it than that, and yet we've come to that point where I need to get filled up. I need energy, and the whole model of food as energy takes away from its real importance. Food talks to our genes, and if you get that message and you get it loud and clear, then every time you stick a forkful of food in your mouth, it changes the way you look at it. Like, is this forkful of food leading to a positive genetic expression, or is it actually leading to a negative genetic expression? And that's it's new stuff for a lot of people, but that's truly what it is. Food is the messenger.
Okay, so you just said something. Did you say food is our genes? Is that what you said?
Food influences genes. It's probably the most significant influence on genetic expression is what we stick in our mouth every single day.
I have to keep that in mind. I have to remember that one.
Yeah, and not one of the meals out of 3, and not one of the snacks we eat. I mean every single time. Yeah. Every single time you put something in your mouth, it has an influence. Now, people would say, "Oh, well, if I have one cookie, it's not going to kill me." And I go, yeah, you're right. If that was the only cookie you ever had in your life. But people who say, if I hope one cookie's not going to kill you, it's never one, right? It's
one ball.
It's one in the morning, one in the afternoon, and one at night, and that wouldn't kill you either, but that applied over the course of weeks, months, and years and decades. Then we've got ourselves a big problem. And again, that then moves back onto the behavioral perspective about latitudes and all these other things that what we're talking about, is that how people give themselves permission, using words like cheat and treat and moderation and all these things, which are basically permissions to not do the right thing.
This is my last one. I'm going to be better tomorrow. That's my thing.
Exactly.
Today, I'm stopping today, but I just have to finish this.
Yeah. And if the conversation in your mind was a little different about the impact of those things and the knowledge of what it actually does, then it helps people not talk like that. It helps them talk in a more positive way, instead of saying, "Oh, this one won't hurt me." The commentary in your brain is, "What can I do to help me?"
Yes.
Oh, geez, I can't wait to eat that avocado because it's going to make my genes excite. There's a very positive way of looking at food, as opposed to kind of an arm's length negative way of looking at it.
There's an Instagram page that I follow. It's called the Green Health Project, and he's like strictly vegan.
Right.
And he doesn't eat a lot of fruit. Most of his stuff is vegetables.
Right.
But he does a lot of those types of posts.
Okay.
More, like, don't look at the candy and how you're going to be satisfied. Look at an avocado as an example, or a banana, or just things like that. So it's one of those pages that sort of helped me. I go back to that one quite often. Yeah.
Pursuing benefit as opposed to avoiding harm. A big difference between the two.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, this wasn't on my list, but I was just thinking about this. Would it be helpful to do a food journal and then sort of somehow be able to relate that back to, okay, here's my food journal for the day. What have I done to harm myself? Like, you're not trying to turn it into a negative, but make it a reality sort of thing.
I think what you're saying is really that is a step that brings awareness to a person. As I suggested before, like the person who leaves their house in the morning, comes home at night with no plan at all, they fill themselves up, and with stopping and thinking, they could probably remember what they ate, but there's no real need or sense that they have to do that. They just go at the end of the day, and they quite honestly don't put much thought into what was put in their mouth that day, right? And the next day they do the same thing all over again. So the food journals, probably more than anything else, bring awareness to the person. You stop, and maybe you do it right after you have everything, or maybe you do it at the end of the day. It doesn't really matter which one. But there's a point where you stop and you think about it, and you write this stuff down, and then it's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that I actually ate that. And maybe it's not that. Quite honestly, maybe people write things down and they'll say, well, I think I did pretty well there. And that's fine. But it just brings a point of knowledge. And we talk about how knowledge leads to confidence, and confidence leads to certainty, and certainty leads to action. But you can't get to proper action if you don't develop knowledge in the first place. So it's that process of going through that helps people become better at understanding what they're eating, and then you add more knowledge. Once a person goes into that area, I think it's kind of it doesn't have to start there. It can start in different places, but for some people, when it starts there, it just introduces the possibility, the potential to start to accumulate more knowledge. And again, as you become more knowledgeable, it's hard to gain more knowledge and still continue to eat a lot of bad food. It seems it's quite counterintuitive to gain knowledge and still behave in an opposite way. So the knowledge part is important to continue to build, and I think food journaling is a good way to start. That being said, you got to know what's good and what's bad, and I think when you get right down to it, most people have a pretty good intuitive sense of what the difference is between good food and bad food. Like, you can put 2 plates down, and you can put a whole bunch of salad with kind of vegetables and maybe a piece of salmon on it if a person's not vegetarian, and you can look at that. Then you can look at another plate that has a whole bunch of other things. You can imagine what it might be. A potato maybe, but some people again don't think of potatoes as being sugar, but that would be the case. A plate that is absent of vegetables, maybe just a hamburger with a bun and a whole bunch of those things, and you look at that and you go, okay, which one is healthier for you? I'm not asking which one you'd like to eat. I say, which one do you think is healthier? People would get the answer correct almost every single time. So it's not that we don't have the intuitive sense of it, it's the application of that sense.
Right.
That's really the key thing.
I think if for certain people, if they looked, if you ask them that question, yes, the vegetable plate is more healthier,
Right.
but the other one's going to fill me up, and it's going to keep me fuller longer.
And isn't that the irony? The irony, that boy, you hit on a key thing right there, is that sense of fullness that we get from eating carbohydrates like bread and potatoes, that it's almost a desired thing in our culture, where the sense of being full. But if that fullness has come from a carbohydrate-driven dinner, you get rapid rises in blood sugar, you get rapid insulin responses to that, which is intended to drive the blood sugars down again. And as soon as the blood sugars drop, then all of a sudden you feel hungry again. And that's the real folly of that kind of interpretation. If you eat a diet that actually has a higher fat concentration in it, which we've been told for 40 years not to do, and in fact it's the worst advice that we had culturally and even around the world, it caused so many of the problems that we have right now, is the high sugar content of our diet and the low fat. In fact, we need to go the opposite direction. But when you eat food that has a higher fat content and a lower carbohydrate, you don't get hungry. You stay full for a long time. I know you know what we're talking about there. And it's quite remarkable to people. You can eat lower levels of caloric volume, meaning less total calories, but when the orientation of the foods is shifted, when you're having more fat and less carbohydrate, it has more staying power, which is a very general commentary, but it just lasts longer because you don't have these rapidly rising and falling blood sugar levels. Everything stays nice and level.
Right.
Yeah, nice and steady.
Interestingly enough, and it took me a while to realize it, but the same effect that I would have from eating, say, a chocolate bar, I'm like, yay, let's go, and then I need a nap an hour later.
Right, yeah.
Same effect from potatoes. If I have potatoes for dinner, I know that within an hour I have to have a nap or sit on the couch, because Potatoes make me tired.
It's a remarkable thing that the glycemic index, which has been around since around the 1970s, there's been a little criticism of it lately that it doesn't have as much applicability, but I think in a general sense, I think it still does. So it was developed by a Canadian, and so it goes from 0 to 100, and so you've got foods that are very low on this scale, like lettuce, as I mentioned, and spinach, and leafy vegetables, and those kinds of things, and other vegetables as well, would be low on this scale, like a number of 20 or lower in some circumstances, and that sugar, sucrose, was actually given the number of 100, kind of arbitrarily. That was as high as it went. The thing that's surprising some people is that there are some starches, including certain forms of potatoes, that have a glycemic index that is actually higher than sugar.
Yikes.
And to people who are listening, it's like, how could that possibly be? And the answer is, it's just the density.
Yeah.
It's how dense the sugars are. And in these starches, it's just really, really dense carbohydrate. And when you hear carbohydrate, again, think sugar. So that's what goes on. And so the response that you get from a potato being similar to a chocolate bar is no surprise at all when you look at it from the glycemic index perspective, because to a large extent they're one and the same thing. People go, no, that can't be the case. Isn't there nutrition in potato? Yeah, but we're not talking about nutrition. There is some. Now, potato is certainly not a nutritious food like a bell pepper is, but there's more nutrition in a potato than there is in a Mars bar, since you mentioned that. But we're not talking about nutrition right now. We're talking about the influence of sugar and the density of sugar. And as I said, repeating myself, but some potatoes have a glycemic index that's higher than sugar, than sucrose.
And that surprised me. Another one that I learned from the program was corn.
Right.
Corn was always a favorite for me. Like, I love corn.
Right.
But then when we talked about the glycemic index, I'm like, oh.
yeah. It's kind of sad, you these foods that we've raised on, quite honestly, and associated with fun things, barbecues, and all this kind of stuff. And that's the cultural piece, and I don't deny that. That's a tricky thing. And corn is up there. It's not as high as a potato, to be fair. And for anyone who's listening, you can just type into Google glycemic index. There'll be hundreds of different scales that you can look at, and you can check these things out. So again, you have to be a little careful. I shouldn't say careful. You have to become knowledgeable first. Again, there's that word, so that you can kind of understand where the pitfalls are in terms of things that we have commonly eaten, but particularly things that are not just commonly eaten, but foods that are also associated with interpreted benefit, right? That we thought that they were helpful and beneficial, not because they actually were, but because culture made us believe that they were. And so they become very commonly eaten. And then when we step in and say, no, you got to avoid that, and they go, well, what are you talking about? My family's been eating these things for 6 generations, and blah, blah, blah. And but that's the shift. That's what we've come to know, is that really moving away from sugar/carbohydrate density is a very important thing to do in terms of reducing this inflammatory tendency. It's a big, big deal.
So while we're talking about inflammation, inflammation and being tired, do they go together?
Oh gosh, you're getting into some really cool stuff here, Darcy. Some great questions. I should say this: I'm not a biochemist. I'm a chiropractor. I took some biochemistry when I was back in university. At that point, quite honestly, it was complex, and I didn't see the connection, and nor was it taught that way, to be really fair.
Right.
But that's where all of this stuff is coming from now. So I know enough about it and have read enough to be able to make sense of it. But the question you just asked there really boils down to that, and that within the cells, if the listeners again can think back to their junior high science classes where you studied the cell, right? And inside every cell, there's 10 trillion of these cells in our body, in all the different places. But within every cell, there's similarities amongst every single one of them, whether it's a nerve cell or a heart cell or anything else. So of course we have the nucleus of the cell, and that's where the genetic material is housed. Another piece of the cell, these are called the organelles of the cell, is one piece called the mitochondria. And the mitochondria is the energy center. That's where the cell takes chemicals, we'll call it food, but it's not like food, that we stick in our mouth. It's the byproducts of all the breakdown of that. And it actually takes these things, puts them through this very, very complex stuff. People have nightmares about the Krebs cycle and all the rest of that stuff, but and we know more about that now too than we did before. But the mitochondria is where energy is being produced. the very short answer to your question is that inflammatory tendencies in the cell not only influence the genetic output in the nucleus, but that inflammatory tendencies also affect the nature of the mitochondria, and they are unable then to produce energy in the same fashion that they're able to do when the communication to the mitochondria from proper food sources is better. So again, bad food produces inflammatory tendencies, and inflammatory tendencies affects the mitochondria, and when the mitochondria doesn't work properly, then we can't produce energy the way that we're supposed to. And the other thing is that some of these chemicals actually lead to oxidization. Now that's a fancy word, but oxidization, you've heard of the term antioxidants. So antioxidants are these chemicals that are actually seek out these things called free radicals, and a free radical is kind of a charged particle that is a natural byproduct of function. So we get free radicals from sunlight, we get free radicals from exercise. So a lot of normal things cause free radicals. It's part of our normal physiology, and we all have antioxidants, and the antioxidants bind to these things, and then the body processes them, and no problem. But when we have high inflammation, we have a much higher production of these free radicals, and the free radicals can get into the mitochondria and actually cause oxidation. The oxidation on a car is called rust, and it's not like the mitochondria rust. Well, I'm not going to suggest that you're going to see rust in a mitochondria if you could get in there and look at it, but it's as if there was rust, and it just leads to the breakdown of the function. So therefore, again, the answer to your question is, does inflammation lead to fatigue? The answer is absolutely it does, because it's directly connected to the ability of the mitochondria to produce energy.
Interesting.
Fascinating.
It is very fascinating.
Yeah.
That could be a whole podcast.
Totally,
right there.
yeah. You know, and when we have to get well, when we have chronic disease, one of the things that's required is the energy to heal. Like, we have to get better, and yet if the nature of the inflammatory problem that has caused heart disease, or has caused type 2 diabetes, or has caused dementia, or has caused anything else, and it requires energy to recover from these things, but the mitochondria in our cells have been compromised by this exact same inflammation, then it becomes harder to do. So that's where we really have to concentrate on not just treating the condition of cardiovascular disease, which is what mainstream medicine, and believe me, when I say that, I knew this was going to come up today. I'm not disparaging medical doctors, nor am I disparaging medicine. I'm just saying that the model that's been used for the last 50 years, in light of the new biochemistry, in light of the new functional medicine approach, it doesn't fit anymore. Like, you can't treat cardiovascular disease without treating the function of the cell and the inflammatory nature, because one is dependent on the other.
Right.
That's really, it's looking at it in a bigger picture perspective. And so using medications to treat blood pressure, or to treat cholesterol, for example, may mitigate the numbers that you see on the blood pressure cuff, or the cholesterol numbers, but is it actually working to actually treat the underlying function of the cell to allow it to function properly again? And the answer is really not, and that's where functional medicine actually goes into that area. So
okay,
cool.
So here's the question then. How about, aside from pharmaceuticals,
Right.
supplements?
Yeah.
Is there something that's, in your opinion, better than others?
Yeah.
Do you need supplements, or can you get it from food?
Boy, great question. That's a really good question. I always, when I answer this question to patients in the clinic, I start by saying this. Supplements are called supplements for a reason. They're not called substitutes.
Good point. Okay.
They're supposed to supplement a good diet. They're not supposed to substitute for a lousy diet. And so there's lots of people out there who are eating crummy food, and they're taking supplements thinking that they've saved themselves. I say that in quotation marks, right?
It's true, though.
But
it
happens all the time, yeah. And in reality, they're not really, I mean, they're better off taking some supplements than if they weren't at all, considering that they're eating really bad food. But that's not healthfulness, I guess, is what I'm suggesting. So really it starts with food. There's no doubt about that. And this area, again, of functional medicine makes that very clear. There's no question that you need to eat a very, very good diet. And as I said earlier on, what you put on your fork multiple times a day and stick in your mouth has greater influence than a whole bunch of other things. Toxicity and all those other things, perhaps we'll get to that. Maybe that'll be another one. But that's That's an important thing, but food is the basis of it all. So putting supplements then on top of food basically turns your food into turbo powered stuff. It just makes it better. And am I a supporter of that? Without question, I am. Eating really good food is the most important thing. There's all kinds of debates, and I think very reasonable positions that are made about, is food quality as good as it was 40, 50, 70, 100 years ago. And we're talking about soils, and we're talking about all kinds of different things, about feeds that they give to animals, and lots of that stuff. And that's, again, that's another whole thing as well. But let's just say that the food quality is probably not as good as it was before because of all of these influences, and therefore we need supplements, these other biochemicals, to boost the value of the food. I think that's a very, very reasonable position. Sadly, the supplement industry is unregulated. There is no agency that oversees the truthfulness or the accuracy of most of the stuff that's out there. And so truly it is a buyer beware circumstance. And so people like myself, people in the health field who deal with nutrition, know what the good companies are. But most of the consumers out there, you go into a health food store and there's thousands of things on the counter, and most people would have no idea what is a good one and which is a bad one. And it's really unfortunate and sad to say. It frustrates me significantly that there's companies out there that suggest on the label that they have so much of this particular element, and when they actually chemically break down what's in it, that it doesn't even have what it says it has on the label. And that's really discouraging.
Yeah.
So you need to get good advice from someone who really knows what they're talking about and what the good companies are. That's a really important piece of advice.
Okay.
You might pay a bit more, but you're getting value. Going back to the Mars bar point, that if you're paying money for a supplement that doesn't have what it said it has, then it may be cheaper, but you're wasting your money. You're not getting anything from it. So
well, that was kind of what I was going to say. Is someone like me, I don't really know exactly what to look for.
And how could you?
Right.
Yeah.
And so when I go, I'll generally go to a health food store over a drugstore.
Right. Yeah.
But for me, it's really based on price. Like
Yeah.
I look at it, or the other thing that I look at is stock on the shelf.
Right.
So the one that there's the least of, that's usually the one that I pick, because okay, well, everybody else buys it, so I might as well too.
And you know what? What you're saying, Darcy, is so truthful and so real and so common. These are cultural things, right? And lots of people would think that way. And yet, when we step back and say, okay, is that really the best way to make a decision based upon, talking to someone like me, for example? And it's not, but I don't blame you for making those decisions. It has some logic to it, right?
Well, yeah.
But there's so much more to it than just that. And God bless the people who are in the health food store. Some of these kids who have got part-time jobs and stuff, they're doing the best they can.
Yeah.
And some of the owners are very knowledgeable. You can get some great advice from some of the people who've been in the field for a while. But the point is, you have to seek out those who really know what they're talking about, and talk to more than one person. Talk to a few, see if you get the same information from different people.
Research.
But the other point I would say about supplements is that I can't tell you how many times people have said, well, I'm taking these things after we get into the conversation, taking all these things, and they start listing them off, and I go, holy mackerel, that's a lot of things. So I say, just bring them to me, stick them in a plastic bag, and bring them to my office. Sitting at this exact table where we're sitting right now, I've had people bring bags in and lay down 25 or 30 different supplements of all kinds of different things. And I say, are you actually taking all of this stuff? Which is, that could be problematic digestively as well, but that's another story. They go, well, sometimes I go in and out, I'm doing some of this, and then I get sick of that, so I take something else. And there's no pattern. They've bought a lot of stuff. Some of it might have some value. Some of it is quite dubious in terms of its scientific value. And we try and pare them down. And so instead of spending all of that money, they might have got them on sale, but look at the total amount that they spent. You're laughing, and maybe you have a similar circumstance. So we usually get them down to, again, recognizing that food is important, and then we get them down to 3 or 4 or 5 key ones.
Right.
And then when they're doing that, there's value in some of these others that, depending on the company, some very, very good quality supplements that target very unique function. But for the most part, what I encourage people to do is to get really good quality, what I guess I'd call broad spectrum. So these things cover a lot of different functions, but they have to be really good quality, and that's what I encourage. But again, when you do very well with these things, these also encourage the effective communication to the genes. Can I go off on a mini tangent here?
Of course you can.
Can I?
Absolutely, yes, please do.
So, fellow who's known as the father of functional medicine. His name is Dr. Jeffrey Bland, he's a PhD in biochemistry, interestingly. And long story made as short as possible. In a book that he wrote, a great book I recommend people read called The Disease Delusion, that he wrote, he speaks of the greatest scientific discovery that he has seen in his entire career. And so he graduated with a biochemistry degree, I think in the late 60s or early 70s, so he's been in the field for 40-something years. And what it was they first found out about this capacity to communicate directly with the genes, as I mentioned earlier on. So that was identified that there is this communication, but the biggest scientific discovery was, in fact, that unique chemicals, and there's a fancy name, I won't describe it now because it's not important, but there are unique chemicals that actually attach to, so they're floating around in the cytoplasm, which is the space in between the cells, and these chemicals will attach to the outside surface of the cell, and then they initiate communication, which goes to the cell. These are the stuff that's in the cell are called kinases. You don't need to remember that, but these kinases communicate from one to the other, one to the other, one to the other, finally gets to the nucleus, gets to the genes, and it causes positive genetic expression. These chemicals, to the greatest extent, are chemicals that are called phytonutrients, and there's a unique group of them. There's a bunch of them, but these phytonutrients, and phyto means plant, so plant nutrients appear to have the greatest influence on initiating positive genetic expression. And so one of the companies that I work with, from a nutritional perspective, designed a unique multivitamin with the very specific and express purpose of putting those nutrients into their multivitamin. So every time you take this stuff, you're swallowing these things knowing that these phytochemicals are going to get into your body and they're actually going to talk to your genes. And so that's when you get into this stuff, you start to understand how really good quality things are actually made and what their intent is. As opposed to, and again, I say this not disparagingly, kind of the standard multivitamin where you got some vitamin C, you got the B vitamins, you got a little bit of A and D and all that kind of stuff, and that's better than a kick in the pants. But when you get into this really targeted kind of nutritional support, that's when things really start to work better. So you take those things and you add that to a good diet, and that's when things really start to work. You start to drive healthfulness. You push yourself towards healthfulness by specific decisions and specific actions, and to me that's like one of the coolest things you could possibly do.
You've just lit up.
yeah, thank you.
Okay, so here's a question on foggy mind.
Yeah.
So if a person was to get themselves on track, and take a multivitamin, a quality one, and eat properly and all of that kind of stuff. I know the answer to this, but I find it fascinating. A lot of people don't realize that they have foggy mind until they come out of it.
Right, exactly.
What can you offer us with respect to that?
Well, it's these are terrific questions you're asking, Darcy. We have to say that science constantly evolves, right? So if you're in the field of science, you have to accept the fact that what is true now might not be true in another 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years, right? So right now, what we've come to learn is so much different than what we knew 20 years ago. And it's really, really interesting. So right now, what it looks like is connected to the question that you asked a few minutes ago about the mitochondria. And that foggy mind, based upon the contemporary science right now, looks as though it is an inflammatory effect on neurons, which the neurons are nerve cells, and of course our brain is full of them, and the inability of the mitochondria in a neuron, which is a specific type of cell, as opposed to the mitochondria, which would be in a heart cell, as I mentioned before, any other type of cell, when that doesn't work properly, brain fog is one of the consequences. So it's still the inflammatory effect on the mitochondria, but it's in that unique cell that produces that outcome. If it was a mitochondria of a different type of cell, it would produce a different outcome. Or if it was in the genes of the cell, it might produce a different outcome. If it was in the endoplasmic reticulum, which is another organelle, it would produce another outcome. So it's where the inflammation affects the function of the cell, and where is that cell in the body. So by reducing inflammatory tendencies in general, for those people who have identified brain fog, it's not an uncommon thing at all. We see it in our program quite commonly. The point you made, which is interesting, is that a lot of people have been in this state for so long, they don't know that they've got it. They can't separate it because it's constantly there. And it's not until they actually produce the change, it's like, whoa, what's going on? All of a sudden there's the world that opens up to them. And I don't say that with hyperbole. I mean, it's quite literal in some cases. They just don't, they've never seen the world in the same way before. It's quite a remarkable outcome.
Well, having gone through the program and experienced that, and as I said, I've kind of fallen off the wagon and been in my sugar binge phase.
You're going to get better.
But I am, definitely. It was funny, I tend to, it's not that I can't focus, but I'll be, okay, I'm going to do this. Oh, but wait, my mind goes over here, and then I go over here, and so I was telling someone this morning that I thought, okay, before I come to meet you today, I'm going to start my housework.
Right.
In 2 hours, all I got done was cleaning my desk and cleaning the keyboard on my computer, because as I would go to get something to clean, something else would trigger, and I'd go over here and I'd go over there. And the response that I had to that was, your house looks like your brain.
Interesting. Very interesting thought. Yeah. That's a neat comment. Again, going back to the book by Dr. Bland, there's a part in the book which I found, to me, really, really interesting the way that it was described, and it's on this cellular communication. It's about all of the things that are going on, and in a body that is not working properly, that is significantly inflamed, the amount of biochemical stuff that's going on is so loud that it's equated to shouting, that the noise in your body is unbelievably high when you have an inflammatory tendency. All of these chemicals are shouting and they all want to get heard. It's a great analogy for insulin resistance. When blood sugars are continually pushed high, the pancreas pushes out insulin to try and drive the sugar in the blood into the tissues, into muscle and into liver. But then the blood sugars go high again, so that the pancreas does its work and there's more insulin, and it keeps going and going and going and going. And over a period of time, the tissues become unresponsive to the presence of insulin. That's what's called insulin resistance. It's one of the very starting phases. Well, the first phase is high blood sugar, but one of the early phases of type 2 diabetes is this phase called insulin resistance. And it defines the condition to a large extent, but it's more and more insulin gets pushed out, as if it's shouting to the cells, hear me, listen to me, I want this to happen, and it gets louder and louder and louder. So what we do now, we didn't do it in your group when you're going through the program, but when we go through one of the sessions in our class, we actually have 6 or 8 people in the room. 2 people are talking about a conversation that we tell them what to talk about. Maybe it's a type of exercise that they like. 2 other people are talking about something else. We'll give them a topic to talk about. 1 person is actually watching the television, and we tell them that you have to tell us what you've heard on the TV. Christopher's talking to them about habit loops. I'm yelling at them about detoxification. So the room is full of this noise. The person who's watching the TV keeps turning it up, because we're going to ask them later what it was that they were talking about the TV, but he can't hear the television because all these other people are talking. So their voices start to rise. Mine rises because I want to tell them about toxicity, and Christopher's yelling at him because he wants them to hear about habit loops. And all the stuff gets louder and louder. We had a woman just a while ago in our grad group. She couldn't handle it, like on an emotional level. She stopped and she said, stop. There's too much noise. And so the analogy is that's what happens in the body. It's the Dr. Bland, to the greatest extent that I can describe it, he says the underlying nature of chronic disease is a cellular communication system that's caught up in a shouting match. Wow. Everybody's yelling. And so part of the nature of eating good food and supplementation, as you brought up, is really the attempt to turn down the volume. You just got to keep turning down the volume.
Okay.
And when we eat foods that are bad, we're turning up the volume. And it's maybe one of the analogies you can have when you next time are exposed to the Mars bar scenario, right? And thank you for saying that, because it provides a perfect example for the people who are listening. Is that, no, I don't want my volume to go any higher. I'm not going to buy those things, even though I get twice as many for only $2.50 more. That means less to me then the sense that I'm going to create a shouting match in my body with every single one of those things that I eat.
Yeah.
And so that's a really neat way of looking at it. And so it's trying to calm down the volume.
Wow.
How you got into this, the question was talking about your cleaning, right?
Yeah.
And it's almost like there's so much going on, and then you equated, the house to
my mind.
to your mind.
Yeah.
It's scattered, and it I don't know that that's exactly what went on. That would be a big leap, from
Yeah.
a clinical perspective.
No.
But it's an interesting conversation to have
Yeah.
about. There's just so much going on, and the whole attempt is to calm that down. Now, there's behavioral ways you can do that. Meditation, right? You can do those kinds of things
Yeah.
to calm that down, and I encourage that. I think there's something to be said about that. Mindfulness is not meditation, but you can use mindfulness to kind of make yourself slow down and stop and consider. But boy, the helter-skelter kind of analogy is a very good one, and that ill health is kind of connected to this helter-skelter
Absolutely.
state,
Yeah.
and we really want everything just to calm down, and that's how you use food and these other things
Yeah.
to create the body, to make the body come to a more calm state.
I wish there was a scientific way to look inside
Yeah,
and see it all, because that's probably the one thing for me that would work,
yeah,
is to be able to, okay, this is what's going on in here.
right,
Not good.
right,
Right?
yeah.
But yeah, so I'm just checking the time here. I know I've taken a lot of your time today.
This is good.
So I'm going to ask you 2 more questions
Okey-doke.
for this one, and then I'm going to ask you if we can have another podcast.
Right on. The answer is yes.
Okay, awesome. So, what would you suggest for someone like me for food, for quick energy, to replace the chocolate bars, the cookies, the candy,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
I'm slumping right now.
Yeah,
What do I go for?
great. Again, another really good question. What's key about the question was the way that you worded it. And you are not unique. This happens lots of times. The word that you used was quick.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like quick, because what quick means is that it's quick there and then it's
Quick
gone.
out.
And then
Right.
it's quick and gone.
Yeah.
We don't want that.
Right.
We want steady energy. We
Okay.
want nice, steady energy. And when the energy's steady, then you don't have the desire for quick. However, I know what you're talking about, and I'll tell you how I know. I think you know the story
Mhm.
here. So I would be a student, and I'm studying and trying to keep my energy up. We all know what we mean by
Yeah.
that. And back in the day when juices were thought to be very helpful for us, there's a bit of a change of the interpretation now because of the sugar concentration in many juices. But I would study for a period of time. I'd go into that bit of a flat state. You know what I'm talking about.
Mhm.
Everyone else who's listening know what that is. It's not that you're hungry, but there's a sense that you're just not firing on all cylinders
Yeah.
quite. I'd go to the fridge, take out the orange juice or the apple juice, so I wouldn't even pour it in a cup, like right out of the jug. Wham! And what I now refer to as a sugar jolt, even though it was considered to be healthful, and perhaps with lots of pulp and all these other kinds of things, there is some level of nutritional value, but that's not what we're talking about. Again, it's just the sugar concentration. Bang! Take a drink, come back to that state, that we covet. And study for a while. Half an hour later, bang. And so I look back at that phase now, as much as I thought I was doing something that was helpful because it was juice and not pop, right? That it was essentially the same thing. And so each time I took a jolt, if you can imagine on a graph, that was a bump of my blood sugar. Bang,
Yeah.
up, bang, up, bang, up. And those are all these quick bursts of energy. But was it steady? And the answer was it couldn't be, because I had to repeat it over and over again. So once a person has gotten to the point where they get away from the sugars and they start to eat a lower sugar, at least in the glycemic index, you're working on the lower end of the scale with a lot more fruits and vegetables, and you push the fat volume up in your diet, then you don't get into the state where you think you need the boost. It's so steady that you don't fall into that state. So the thing that drives people to eat when they're in this, we'll call it a ketogenic state, and boy, we have to be careful when we use that word, because some people hear that and they think 80% of their calories are coming from fat. That's dopey. It's been used in some circumstances historically, going back almost 100 years now, for epilepsy, with very interesting results. But people hear that and they think it's crazy high fat, and we're not talking about that. We're talking about mildly ketogenic, just past halfway, so that slightly more energy consumption is created by fat than it is by carbohydrate, and I guess protein to a certain extent. So it's mildly ketogenic. But when you're in that state, you don't have the need to get the quick burst, and so it's steady all the time, and that's the transition. But boy, it's easy to say. It's a harder thing to conceptualize unless you've been there. And once you're in that state, then you don't have the need. What happens at that point is people still have the behavioral things that they are connected to, and they go, okay, my energy's good, my brain is clear, I know I don't need to eat, but I'm going to walk over to the fridge anyways. We do it all the time. And I am, admittedly, I'm a fridge opener. I don't know how. I just open it up. I'd say 9 times out of 10 I never grab anything. I just like looking, right? And then maybe people out there have a similar thing. And as soon as I open the fridge, I say, what are you doing? And I usually shut the door and then I walk away kind of thing. But that's connected to, patterns and stuff. But I would say seeking quick energy is part of the problem, that we don't want to seek quick energy. We want to actually seek steady energy, and when you're in that state, then you don't have the need to have to get these quick boosts.
Okay, good answer. Okay, so my last question for this podcast is it possible to, so I'm talking myself personally, I don't know really all of the effects of my huge sugar addiction, what it's caused, but whatever's in there, can I reverse it?
Yeah, I would say to the very greatest extent the answer is yes. Why do I say that? One of the tenets of the functional medicine movement is that you don't use food just to create health. You use food to cure disease. That's a very, very important thing, and I'm not saying these are, just people who have ideas or thoughts or concepts, who are spewing these thoughts out. This is coming from some very, very high-end science. I mean, at the very top universities in the world, really. A lot of the ones on the East Coast of the United States, Harvard and Johns Hopkins and all these places where big researches are being done, they're saying, holy mackerel, it's fascinating to see that when we get this part right, the impact that it has on health. So I would say the answer is yes, generally. Now, how far along the pathway is a person in the course of their condition? That's a very important interpretation. And if someone is really near the end of their life because of chronic disease, can food cure that? You'll hear some stories about some miracles. I don't think it's really a miracle as much as it is the application of proper biochemistry. So sometimes it happens, but for a person at your point in your life, middle age more or less, do you have enough time left in your life to actually right the ship and create healthfulness in your life? The answer is without question. There's no doubt about that. The initiation of positive lifestyle change can be done really in 12 weeks. I don't mean permanently. That means people will notice change in 12 weeks. One of the troubles is they go, oh, I'm ever glad that's over, right? Right? They go back to their old patterns, and they end up clearly back where they were before. So 12 weeks, I want to make sure that when I say this to the listeners, I'm not saying that 12 weeks is the cure. 12 weeks is a point in which you will notice change. In the majority of people, they will notice some aspect of change. And as you kind of suggested before, with the brain fog point, is that you might not even know what it is that you're going to experience. You might be hoping for one thing, and maybe that will change, but it might be something completely different too, because you just don't know how the body's going to unwind itself. But so the answer is yes. There is no question that you do these things right, and it will have a greater impact on producing healthfulness for the rest of your life than any other thing you could do. And when I mean environmental, I don't mean just diet. We're talking about exercise as well. We're talking about detoxifying the body, which is a hugely important piece. These persistent organic pollutants that are in our bodies is another huge driver of inflammatory tendencies. And detoxicity has been around. It's been in the holistic field for a long while. This is mainstream stuff. We know the significant effects of BPA and phthalates and all these other things. It's big stuff. So that and free radical damage from exposure to a whole bunch of different environmental phenomena, and having enough antioxidants in your diet or through supplementation to be able to quench these free radicals, because that's another driver of inflammation. Those are the big three: the diet, the toxicity, and free radical damage. I already mentioned exercise. All of those things are really important, but when they're done properly, you can create health. No question about that.
Excellent. You've got me motivated again.
Yay!
So this is good.
Good.
Dr. Breen, thank you
Oh,
very
it's been
much for
my
your
pleasure.
time today.
My pleasure.
I have a ton more questions.
Right on.
So I'm inviting you back.
Oh, I'd love to do it. Yeah, it'd be great.
We'll work on a convenient time for you. I know you're busy.
Yeah, we'll do it for sure.
But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.